The Arctic, a place where time stood still, had always been a frozen graveyard of forgotten secrets. But some things refused to remain buried. In 2018, a satellite scanning the icy expanse picked up an anomaly beneath nearly 60 meters of ice, something metallic, cylindrical. At first, scientists dismissed it as Cold War debris or a natural ice formation, but further analysis revealed something extraordinary. It was a submarine. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. Not just any submarine. It was the Ludwig, a German U-boat that had vanished without a trace in 1943. The discovery sent shockwaves through the scientific and military communities. If the submarine had been frozen in ice for over 7 decades, how could the satellite have detected movement around it? Who or what was patrolling the wreck? Dr. William Carter, a 55-year-old marine archaeologist, had spent his life uncovering the secrets of the deep. He had studied Viking shipwrecks, lost WWII vessels, and Cold War submarines. But nothing prepared him for this. The satellite scans unsettled him. He scrutinized the data once more, his hands gripping the edge of his desk. The tracks near the wreck weren't random. They moved in deliberate patterns, circular loops, back and forth pacing, as if something had been guarding the site. But who would be out there in a place so desolate that even polar bears rarely venture? There was no record of recent military operations, no research stations nearby. And the biggest question of all, why now? The Ludwig had been frozen for over 75 years. If the satellite had picked up movement, it meant something had only recently started disturbing the ice. The National Science Foundation had personally requested Carter to lead the mission, and the U.S. Navy had approved limited logistical support. A WWII submarine, perfectly preserved beneath the Arctic ice, was a discovery too significant to ignore. But something told Carter this wasn't just a routine expedition. This was a recovery mission into the unknown. By early March 2018, Carter and his team landed at an isolated Arctic outpost, the closest accessible base before heading deeper into the ice field. The team was small, 3 scientists, 2 naval engineers, and a survival expert named Daniel Briggs. They set off toward the site in tracked snow vehicles, battling relentless winds and temperatures that dipped to 40 C. After 2 days of grueling travel, they reached the location. The ice stretched endlessly around them, unbroken and pristine, except for one thing. The tracks. They were real, and they were fresh. Carter's breath clouded the air as he knelt, inspecting them. Too large for a human, too precise for an animal. Whatever had been pacing, the ice had done so recently. The team set up camp and began drilling through the ice. It took 12 hours of intense labor, but finally, the drill bit punched through into an open cavity. The sub had been trapped in a natural air pocket, preventing it from being fully crushed. As the team rappelled down, flashlights flickered against the rusted steel hull. The sub bore no obvious signs of damage. No explosion, no external impact. It was as if it had been abandoned. But when Carter pushed open the hatch and stepped inside, his blood ran cold. The first thing they saw were the bodies. Frozen, perfectly preserved crew members still in their uniforms. Some were slumped over consoles, others sprawled across the floor. Their faces were twisted in expressions of terror. No signs of a struggle. No bullet wounds. They had died in fear. Briggs turned, shining his flashlight further down the corridor. "What the hell happened here?" he muttered. Carter's pulse pounded as he moved deeper into the sub, carefully stepping over the frozen remains. Then he saw the captain's log, still clutched in skeletal fingers. He pried it loose and flipped it open. The last entry was dated November 4, 1943. "We have made contact with something under the ice. It moves unlike anything we have seen before. It knows we are here. We are not alone." Carter's hands trembled. He turned the page. The ink was smeared, the handwriting frantic. "They are inside," the walls whisper. "We shouldn't have come." The final words were scrawled so forcefully they had nearly torn through the paper. "We are already dead." A sharp clank echoed through the sub. The sound of metal shifting. The team froze. Carter turned his flashlight toward the source of the noise. Deep in the shadows of the corridor, something moved. A flicker of darkness, impossibly fast. Then the temperature dropped. Not the gradual cold of Arctic air, but something unnatural. A biting, piercing cold that sucked the warmth from their bodies instantly. Their breath became ice crystals in the air. "Get out," Briggs whispered. "Now." The radio crackled. The technician stationed at the surface yelled, "Something's coming from beneath the ice." It's... The transmission cut off. The sub lurched violently, tilting to one side. From above, a deafening crack ripped through the ice. The sound of something breaking through. Something massive. Carter didn't hesitate. Move. Get to the surface. They scrambled up the ropes as the sub groaned beneath them. As Carter reached the top, he turned for one last look. For a brief moment, deep in the darkened hull of the submarine, he saw them. Figures, inhuman, shifting, watching. Then the ice exploded. Carter and the team barely made it out as the submarine was swallowed back into the abyss, vanishing beneath the ice. Silence. Briggs was gasping beside him. The others stared at the hole where the sub had been, their faces pale with terror. Carter exhaled shakily. The Arctic had kept its secret once. It had taken Ludwig and its crew. And now, whatever had been inside, whatever had been waiting, was free. The expedition was classified. The records sealed. The official story would say that the sub collapsed under its own weight and was lost again. But Carter knew the truth. Some things were never meant to be found. And some secrets should stay buried in the ice. The Arctic had always been a place where the past refused to stay buried. A frozen tomb for lost ships, forgotten expeditions, and history's strangest mysteries. But as Dr. William Carter and his team stood before the unearthed wreckage of U-977, they knew this was no ordinary discovery. For 5 days, they had carved through ancient ice, revealing the submarine that had vanished in 1943 without a trace. Yet, as much as they had uncovered, something far more disturbing remained hidden. The wolves, massive, silent, and ever watching, had been circling their excavation site from the moment they arrived. No aggression, no attacks, just waiting. And now, as the rusted hatch groaned open for the first time in 75 years, Carter couldn't shake the feeling that whatever lay inside was not meant to be disturbed. The moment the hatch was forced open, a blast of air rushed out a breath from another time. The scent of oil, rust, and decay filled the frigid air. The team hesitated, exchanging uneasy glances. Carter turned on his headlamp and stepped inside. The interior was eerily intact. Rusted dials and frozen levers lined the control panels. Yellowed charts lay scattered across the navigation table. But it was what sat at the helm that made Carter's breath catch in his throat. The captain was still there. His body, frozen solid, remained seated in his chair, fingers locked around the periscope, as if he had been watching something in his final moments. His face, preserved by the ice, was twisted in an expression of sheer terror, a scream that never escaped. Helena Brooks, the biologist, stepped in behind Carter. "Oh my God," she whispered. "What happened to them?" Carter moved deeper into the sub, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. More bodies. The entire crew, dozens of them, were still inside. Some slumped over their stations. Others collapsed in the narrow corridors. No gunshot wounds. No signs of struggle. No emergency exit attempts. They had all died where they sat or stood. Carter's stomach twisted. This wasn't a battle casualty. This was something else. Near the radio room, Carter spotted something clenched in one of the officer's hands, a logbook. He pried it from the frozen grip, flipping through brittle pages. The final entry was dated November 4, 1943. "We have made contact with something beneath the ice. It moves unlike anything we have seen before. It knows we are here." Carter's pulse pounded as he read on. The handwriting grew frantic, the ink smudged in places. "We are not alone. They're outside. Watching, waiting." Then the last sentence, scrawled in jagged strokes. "They are inside. We shouldn't have come. A sharp clank echoed through the sub. The sound of metal shifting. Carter and Helena froze. From deeper inside the submarine, something moved. Something still here. Briggs, the survival expert, radioed from outside. Carter, we have a problem. The wolves. His voice cut out. The radio crackled with static. Carter turned toward Helena, his breath visible in the frigid air. We need to get out. Now. They retraced their steps toward the hatch when a new sound filled the submarine, whispering. Low. Unintelligible. But not human. The air inside the submarine suddenly felt wrong, thicker, heavier. The temperature dropped further. Carter's headlamp flickered. Then, from behind them, a frozen corpse moved. A crew member who had been slumped against the wall moments ago shifted, his fingers twitching. His head turned slightly, his frostbitten lips parting in what might have once been speech. Carter and Helena ran. Scrambling through the narrow corridor, they reached the hatch and hauled themselves up the ropes. The moment Carter surfaced, he saw Briggs running toward him, rifle in hand. They're coming, Briggs shouted. Carter spun around just as the ice behind them cracked open. Not from beneath, from within. The submarine lurched, a deep metallic groan shuddering through its structure as if something was trying to break free. Then the wolves howled, a chilling, otherworldly sound. The pack, once distant, now stood in formation, their eyes glowing in the dim Arctic light. Not attacking, not running. Waiting. Carter felt the weight of the logbook in his hand. The last captain of U-977 had warned them. We shouldn't have come. And now, whatever had been trapped in that submarine for decades, whatever had waited, was finally waking up. The mission was immediately classified. The excavation team was extracted, and satellite surveillance of the area was increased. The official report stated that U-977 had been recovered but had collapsed due to structural failure before a full investigation could be conducted. But Carter knew the truth. From a secure research facility weeks later, he sat staring at the logbook. His fingers traced over the words. They are inside. We shouldn't have come. He glanced at a separate document on his desk, infrared scans taken from the final moments at the site. The images were grainy, distorted by interference. But the figures inside the submarine, the ones that had begun to move, they were no longer human. And the wolves? Surveillance drones still picked up their tracks around the site. Still circling. Still waiting. As if guarding something that should never be unleashed. Because some things were meant to stay buried. Some things should never be found. The frozen secret beneath the ice. Dr. William Carter traced his gloved fingers over the frostbitten logbook, each word sending an unsettling chill down his spine. The last known entry from Captain Heinrich Kaufmann painted a picture of fear, isolation, and something far more terrifying than the brutal Arctic cold. The crew of U-977 had not simply vanished. They had been waiting. The first significant entry was dated October 12, 1943. We have been given orders for a mission classified beyond top secret. The destination is the Arctic. Coordinates undisclosed until arrival. The officers do not question, but I see doubt in their eyes. Even the Effer himself has taken an interest in this operation. What are we looking for out here? Carter's stomach tightened. This was no routine patrol. U-977 had been sent on a mission so secretive, even its captain had been left in the dark. Flipping further, the entries grew more erratic. October 18, 1943. We have arrived at our destination. There is nothing here. Only endless ice. The radio signals have started to behave strangely, messages repeating distorted voices. We do not know who is transmitting them. October 20, 1943. We have discovered something. An object beneath the ice. We were ordered to investigate. I do not believe we should. October 22, 1943. Schmidt went outside last night. He never returned. But in the morning, his footprints were still there, leading out into the snow. And next to them, there were tracks. Massive ones. Not a bear. Not a wolf. Something else. Carter's breathing shallowed. October 25, 1943. The ice is shifting. We hear them at night, low howls that do not belong to wolves. They do not attack. It is as if they are waiting for something. October 27, 1943. We are no longer alone. Then, the final, chilling entry, the ink jagged, the strokes uneven as if written in a frenzy. They are inside. Carter's blood ran cold. A sudden, sharp crack echoed through the submarine. Helena froze, her hand hovering over the logbook. Did you hear that? Carter nodded stiffly. The sound wasn't from their team. It came from below. The U-977 shuddered, as if something had shifted within its frozen tomb. The air grew heavier, the shadows along the rusted walls seeming to stretch and pulse. Then, another noise closer this time. A scraping sound, slow and deliberate, like something moving through the corridors. Reynolds, the military historian, backed up. We should go, now. But Carter's scientific curiosity fought against his survival instincts. He turned toward the submarine's inner chamber, where rows of frozen bodies remained seated at their stations. One of them moved. It was barely noticeable, a shift of a frozen finger, the tilt of a head, a breath that shouldn't have been possible after 75 years beneath the ice. Helena gasped. That's not possible. But Carter knew better. It was happening. Then came the first low whisper, curling through the submarine's steel corridors, weaving into the frozen air. The dead were waking up. Move! Carter shouted. The team scrambled, pushing toward the hatch as the submarine creaked under some unseen force. The lights from their headlamps flickered, casting elongated shadows against the rusted walls. The frozen crew, once still, were no longer just corpses. Something else was inside them. Carter hauled himself through the open hatch, hitting the ice just as a deafening screech rang out from within the submarine. Behind him, Helena and Reynolds scrambled to the surface, their faces pale with terror. Then, the wolves began to howl. The Arctic wind carried the sound, long and guttural, a call that reverberated across the frozen wasteland. Carter turned to face them, the same massive creatures that had been watching them for days. But now, their stance had changed. They were no longer waiting. They were guarding. The ice beneath them cracked violently. With an ear-splitting groan, the U-977 began to sink. The frozen tomb that had held it for 75 years was swallowing it back into the depths. The team staggered backward, watching in horror as the wreckage vanished beneath the ice. It was as if something had dragged it back down. Then, the wolves turned as if satisfied with the outcome and disappeared into the snow, their tracks vanishing just as quickly. Carter stood there, his breath coming in heavy gasps, the logbook clutched tightly in his hands. He didn't know what they had just witnessed, but one thing was clear. 3 weeks later, Carter sat in a classified debriefing room. The official report would bury the truth, stating that U-977 had collapsed during excavation, its remains now unreachable beneath the ice. The satellite scans showing the tracks had been scrubbed. And the wolves? No one spoke of them. But Carter knew what he saw. They had been guarding something, and whatever had been inside that submarine had never been meant to resurface. As he flipped through the logbook one last time, he ran his fingers over the final sentence, the last words of Captain Kaufman before he and his crew had been claimed by something beyond understanding. They are inside. Carter closed the book. And in the distance, carried on the Arctic wind, he swore he heard the wolves howling again. Dr. William Carter stood in the Arctic night, the frigid air burning his lungs as he stared at the ancient submarine locked beneath the ice. The logbook in his gloved hands trembled slightly, not from the cold but from the weight of the words written within. The crew of U-977 had not died from the cold. They had not been lost in battle. They had sealed themselves inside, as if they knew what was coming. And outside, the wolves had stopped moving, not pacing, not watching. They were waiting. Dr. Helena Brooks knelt beside the newest set of radar scans, her breath a thin mist in the Arctic air. The team had used ground-penetrating sonar to scan the ice layers surrounding the wreck, hoping to understand why the submarine had been preserved so perfectly. But what they had found instead made no sense. Helena ran a hand through her hair, her voice quiet but urgent. "Carter, you need to see this." He crouched beside her, peering at the screen. The ice layers told a story of movement tracks formed decades ago, buried deep beneath the oldest layers of ice. Footprints. They'd expected to find wolf tracks, but these were different. Larger, heavier, not human. And yet, they followed a pattern. "They aren't random," Helena whispered. "They circled the submarine." Carter exhaled sharply, trying to make sense of it. So, something or someone was already out here before the ice buried the wreck? Helena swallowed. Or after. The silent crew. The team stepped cautiously back inside U-977, their flashlights cutting through the frozen tomb. The bodies of the crew remained where they had fallen, perfectly preserved, untouched by decay. Reynolds, the military historian, shifted uneasily. None of them tried to escape. Carter nodded grimly. That was the most unsettling part. Even when ships had catastrophic failures, the crew always fought to survive. But here, no one had moved. Their faces were frozen in eerie peace, as if they had accepted their fate long before the end had come. A soft crack echoed through the submarine. Helena spun around, flashlight trembling. "Did you hear that?" Carter held up a hand, listening. A second crack. Louder. Not from inside. From beneath. The ice. Reynolds pulled out his radio, his voice tense. "Base, this is Reynolds. We have an anomaly at the site. We need... A sound cut him off. A low howl. Not from the wolves outside. This was deeper, longer, vibrating through the metal of the submarine itself. Then the lights flickered. Helena grabbed Carter's arm. "That sound, it's coming from below us." Carter's mind raced. The tracks buried deep in the ice, the crew's final, frantic logbook entries, the sealing of the hatch. They weren't just running from something on the surface. They were running from something beneath. Carter flipped back to the last page of the logbook, his pulse hammering. "We should not have come here. They are already here." A heavy metallic groan shuddered through U-977. The ice shifted beneath them, deep fractures forming along the submarine's frozen prison. Reynolds cursed. "We need to get out of here now." Helena rushed toward the hatch, Carter on her heels. The air grew heavy, as if something unseen was pressing down upon them. Then, as they climbed through the hatch, Carter saw it, the crewmen's faces. Their expressions had changed. They were no longer at peace. Their frozen eyes stared wide open, as if in terror. The team stumbled into the open air, breathless, as a deep rumble rolled beneath their feet. The ice beneath the submarine began to split, massive cracks spiderwebbing outward. The wolves howled again, but this time they turned away, running back into the Arctic darkness. "That's never a good sign," Reynolds muttered. Helena grabbed Carter's arm, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's waking up." Carter felt it too, an unnatural presence, something old, something that had been waiting beneath the ice. The ground shook violently. Then, from deep below the ice, something knocked back. A sound not meant for human ears. Something calling out from beneath the wreck. Helena's hand tightened around his wrist. "We have to go. Now." The cracks widened, chunks of ice breaking away as the submarine began to sink back into the depths. The team sprinted for the convoy, throwing themselves onto the vehicles just as the ground collapsed. A massive chasm opened where U-977 had been, and then silence, as if it had never been there. The ice froze over almost immediately, sealing its secret once again. Carter sat breathless in the snow vehicle, staring at the logbook still clutched in his hands. The last words of Captain Kaufman echoed in his mind. "We should not have come here. They are already here." The Arctic had never meant to give up its secrets. And whatever had been beneath U-977, whatever the crew had seen in their final moments, had simply been waiting. Still waiting. for the next ones to come. Dr. William Carter exhaled slowly, his breath crystallizing in the freezing air as he stared at the mysterious crate. The metal was worn but unnaturally cold beneath his gloved fingers. The etched symbols, they weren't military insignia. "What the hell is this?" Lieutenant James Reynolds muttered, stepping closer, his rifle held tightly at his side. Dr. Helena Brooks, standing just behind them, narrowed her eyes as she brushed away a layer of frost from the markings. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "These aren't German. These are much older." Carter's pulse quickened. The submarine logbook had hinted at something lurking in the ice, something the crew had sealed themselves away from. Could this crate hold the answer? Outside, the wolves had stopped pacing. They stood silent, unmoving, their golden eyes locked onto the wreck as if they knew what lay beneath. As if they had been waiting for this moment. Opening Pandora's box. Reynolds motioned for the team's engineer, a man named Daniel Shaw, to inspect the lock. "This mechanism, it's way more advanced than anything from the 1940s, Shaw murmured. He traced the grooves with his fingers, frowning. "Hell, it looks almost modern." That sent a chill through Carter's spine. He knew history. He knew wartime technology. But this had no place on a German U-boat from 1943. Shaw worked fast, setting up a thermal cutter to melt through the rusted steel bindings. The team stood tense, watching as the metal hissed and cracked beneath the heat. And then, a click. The lock released. Carter hesitated, fingers tightening around the edge of the crate. The air in the submarine seemed thicker, pressing against him as though warning him not to continue. He ignored it. With a deep breath, he pried the crate open. Inside, something glowed. Helena gasped, stepping forward despite herself. "Oh my God!" Inside, the crate was a sphere, no larger than a human skull, pulsing with a faint blue light. Its surface was black stone, covered in those same ancient etchings that had been carved into the metal. It hummed, a deep, low vibration that sent a wave of nausea through Carter's stomach. "This isn't human," Carter murmured. Reynolds, gripping his rifle, muttered, "Then what the hell is it?" Helena reached for it instinctively. The moment her fingers brushed the surface, the lights in the submarine flickered violently. And outside, the wolves howled. A sound so deep, so unnatural, that it seemed to vibrate through the very ice beneath them. Carter yanked Helena back, breaking whatever connection had been formed. The glowing sphere pulsed faster, its light intensifying. Then the walls of the submarine trembled. A deep groan echoed through the wreck, as if the metal itself was screaming. "We need to get out of here now." Reynolds barked, already moving toward the hatch. Helena stumbled backward, eyes wide with fear. "The ice, it's cracking." Carter grabbed the logbook, stuffing it into his pack before securing the artifact inside. Whatever this was, it was never meant to be found. Outside, the wolves were moving. But not away. They were forming a circle around the submarine, as if they were trapping them inside. The team rushed out of the wreck, their boots crunching against the brittle ice. The Arctic wind howled around them, but beneath that sound, Carter swore he heard something else. A whisper. Not from a person. Not from the wind. Something older. Helena grabbed his sleeve, her voice shaking. "Carter, we need to leave this thing behind." Reynolds was already radioing for an emergency evacuation, his voice taut with urgency. But Carter's gaze was locked on the wolves. They stood at the edge of the excavation site, their eyes glowing unnaturally in the darkness. And for the first time, Carter understood. They weren't protecting the submarine. They were protecting everything else from what was inside. The ice closes again. The ground shuddered beneath them as they scrambled toward their vehicles. Cracks splintered across the ice, racing toward the wreck. Then, in one thunderous collapse, the submarine was swallowed by the frozen abyss. Gone, as if it had never been there. As if the ice itself refused to let it be uncovered. The howling stopped. The wolves turned and vanished into the storm. Carter stood breathless, the artifact clutched in his pack, the weight of it heavier than he could comprehend. "We shouldn't have come here," Helena whispered, her face pale. Carter's voice was hoarse. I don't think we had a choice. The team barely made it back to base before a blizzard rolled in, wiping away every trace of their presence. When Carter sent the final report, it was heavily redacted before reaching the public. The official statement? The wreck of U-977 was located beneath Arctic ice. No remains were recovered. No artifacts of significance were found. Lies. Carter knew what they had seen. And, more terrifyingly, he knew that something had seen them too. But the world wasn't ready for the truth. And maybe, just maybe, the ice had buried it for a reason. Dr. William Carter stood motionless, the Arctic wind cutting through him like a blade. The artifact, if that's what they could even call it, still pulsed faintly beneath its blackened, ancient surface. It was wrong. Not just in its presence, but in the way it made the very air around it heavy. The Nazis had come looking for something buried long before their war, before any war. And they had found it, but they had not survived it. The wolves had never left. Carter turned his gaze toward the distant ridge where the silent sentinels stood. Their yellow eyes glowed in the dim Arctic twilight, their bodies perfectly still, unbothered by the howling wind. They had been watching, waiting, guarding something that should never have been disturbed. He thought back to the logbook. The final entry, written in shaking hands, "We should not have come here. They are coming." What had the Nazi crew really seen? Helena broke the silence first. "We can't take this back," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You know that, don't you?" Carter nodded slowly. The black box, its warmth unnatural even in the sub-zero cold, sat in the open cargo hold of U-977. If it was removed, if it was taken away, what would follow? Lieutenant James Reynolds had his rifle drawn, knuckles white around the grip. "So what do we do? Just leave it here?" Carter exhaled, his breath misting in the frozen air. "No," he turned to the military engineers. "Seal the wreck." Helena's eyes widened. "You're serious?" Carter nodded. "Whatever happened here, it must not happen again." Reynolds hesitated, then turned toward the ice drill teams. "You heard him. Collapse the entry. Seal it all back up." The next 12 hours were a frantic effort. Heavy equipment was brought in. The Arctic ice, already beginning to shift unnaturally after the wreck's disturbance, was reinforced with steel supports and frozen layers of reinforced barriers. The artifact remained inside. By dawn, the U-977 was entombed once more. No research, no further excavation. Nothing but ice and silence. The moment the last layer of ice was refrozen, the wolves moved. For the first time since the team's arrival, they turned away from the site. Their duty was done. Carter watched them go, disappearing into the white wilderness. They had never come to hunt, only to ensure that what was buried remained that way. And now, with their task complete, they faded back into the snow as if they had never existed. The official report. Weeks later, as Carter sat at a military briefing, he watched as classified documents were stamped and sealed. The official story would say the submarine had been located, its contents inconclusive. No mention of the artifact, no mention of the logbook's warnings, and certainly no mention of the things that had watched from the ice. But Carter knew better. Some secrets were never meant to be uncovered. Some things belonged to the cold and the dark. And if they were lucky, they would stay that way. Dr. William Carter stood at the edge of the Arctic wasteland, staring at the black stone monument now marking the final resting place of U-977. The research team had done what they came to do, but they had also made a choice. Some secrets should remain buried. The reinforced ice entombing the submarine would ensure that whatever lay within whatever had claimed the crew all those years ago would never be disturbed again. The wolves had always known. And now, so did they. Helena Brooks ran in her fingers over the monument's inscription, her breath forming soft clouds in the frigid air. In memory of those lost aboard, U-977, 1943. And in honor of the unseen guardians, the wolves of the north, the sentinels who never forget. She exhaled slowly. "Do you think they understand?" Carter followed her gaze to the wolves, still standing on the distant ridge, their golden eyes reflecting the Arctic light. He watched the largest among them, a scarred, white-coated alpha, its head held high. "I think they've always understood," Carter murmured. Lieutenant James Reynolds, arms crossed against the cold, shook his head. "You really think they've been protecting it all this time? Protecting us from it?" Carter didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked out over the endless snow, feeling the weight of everything they had learned and everything they would never know. "Maybe they're just following something older than instinct," he finally said. "Maybe they're doing what they've always done." Reynolds frowned. "And what's that?" Carter's voice was barely a whisper. "Keeping the balance." The last of the team finished loading the equipment. The helicopters, engines rumbling, prepared for takeoff. But Carter lingered, his gaze following the wolves as they moved in unison across the ice. Their path was precise, unchanging, the same loop they had walked for decades, maybe longer. Would they still be here in another 75 years? Would they still keep their vigil when no one else remembered? The Arctic wind howled, carrying a deep, haunting sound through the frozen silence. It wasn't just the wind. It was something else, a reminder, a warning, a farewell. Carter pulled his coat tighter, the chill sinking into his bones. He knew this was not an ending, only a return to what had always been. One of the wolves stopped and turned. The Alpha. For a moment, it locked eyes with Carter. A knowing glance. A silent understanding. Then, just as it had for generations, it turned back toward the endless white and disappeared into the storm. The mystery of U-977 was buried once more. But the wolves would never leave. And some secrets would never be told. The Silent Guardians, a lesson from the Arctic. The story of U-977 and the wolves of the Arctic is more than just a chilling mystery. It's a reflection of the delicate balance between the past and the present, knowledge and restraint, discovery and respect. In our modern world, we are constantly driven to uncover, expose, and dissect the unknown, believing that every mystery must be solved, every secret unearthed. But sometimes, the greatest wisdom lies not in what we find, but in what we choose to leave untouched. We live in an age where technology allows us to reach deeper into the ocean, further into space, and faster into the past than ever before. Science and progress have become our modern pursuit, much like the Nazis searching the Arctic for something they were never meant to find. But how often do we stop to ask, should we? Like the wolves who kept watch over U-977, there are things in life that are not meant to be disturbed. This applies not only to history and science, but also to our personal lives. We often chase answers, dig up old wounds, and pry open doors that were long shut, believing we need closure. Yet, some things are better left behind, not out of fear, but out of respect for what they were and what they can still teach us. The guardians in our own lives. The wolves in the Arctic are a powerful metaphor for the guardians in our own lives, people, traditions, and even instincts that remind us of the boundaries that should not be crossed. Whether it's an elder passing down stories, a mentor advising caution, or even that small inner voice warning us not to go too far, we all have something that tries to keep us from making the same mistakes of those before us. Yet, like Carter and his team, we often dismiss warnings until we are face to face with the consequences. We ignore history's lessons, believing we know better, that we are stronger, smarter, more advanced. But history does not forget. The wolves remembered, even when humans did not. They walked the same path, keeping a silent watch over something the world had long since abandoned, protecting it from being disturbed again. How often do we return to things we should have let go? A past relationship, an old grudge, a regret? We dig up what's buried, hoping to find something different, only to realize that some things are better left in the ice. Understanding when to walk away. The greatest lesson from U-977 is this. Sometimes the best way to honor the past is to let it rest. We must learn when to walk away from toxic relationships, from destructive habits, from endless pursuits of things that will never bring peace. Just as the research team sealed the submarine beneath the ice, so too must we learn to close certain chapters in our lives. Not because we are afraid, But because we understand that some things are meant to remain mysteries, and some battles do not need to be fought again, the wolves will always return, keeping their silent watch over what was lost. And perhaps, in our own lives, we should learn to do the same, guarding the lessons of the past without needing to relive them, respecting the balance of what was and what must remain untouched. If this story touched your heart, let me know in the comments below. Like, share, and subscribe for more tales that inspire and move us. Thank you for being part of this journey. See you in the next story. If this story touched your heart, let me know in the comments below. Like, share, and subscribe for more tales that inspire and move us. Thank you for being part of this journey. See you in the next story.